Good evening. I'm Dr. Leslie Etienne, and I am the founding executive director of the Center for Africana Studies and Culture at IUPUI, and the director of the Africana Studies program in the School of Liberal Arts. We're so happy to bring to you this evening the inaugural critical discussion series, Conversations with ALelia Bundles. We couldn't be more excited to be working with this wonderful activist, journalist, and author. And I'm happy to be a part of with other faculty members of the Bundles team, as we affectionately are known. Dr. Tyrone Freeman, Dr. Rhonda Henry, Dr. Patricia Turley, Dr. Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and a number of other folks who put in the effort to help gather and pull things together for this series and this prestigious fellow project that we are working on with Ms. Bundles. We'd like to thank our dean, Tammy Idle, our producer, the super producer, John Greenhoe, and all the Africana Studies faculty and other faculty and staff of the School of Liberal Arts, and with a special thanks to Ms. Alice Hardy. So without further ado, we'd like to get the night started. Thank you all for logging in.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I'm the Associate Professor of Africana Studies and Religious Studies at IUPUI, and it is such a pleasure to have you with us this evening. We are in store for an amazing treat, for a fantastic conversation, and lest I say, just an enjoyable time to think about the amazing culture and witness that these folks have to share with us about the Midwest, about Indianapolis, and their experiences as being thinkers and thought leaders in this area. So I'm so excited to have this conversation tonight about Blackness, the Midwest, cultural resistance, and popular culture, and we are joined with an amazing panel of scholars, thinkers, artists, public intellectuals who are going to provide us some context and some gloss so that we can really have a conversation that opens us up to the possibilities of our future, but also learning from the great witness of our past and our histories as Black folks in this country and particularly in this region. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our panel for this evening. We have with us Eric Dagans. Raised in Gary, Indiana, he is an award-winning journalist and the author of Race Baiter, How the Media Wields Dangerous Words to Divide a Nation, and he currently serves as the first full-time TV critic of NPR. We also have with us Miss Mariah Ivy, she was a poet, a musician, and a scholar, as well as an educator and curator living, working, and from Indianapolis. She is the founder and host of a local performing arts hub called That Piece Open Mic, and one half of a genre-bending hip-hop soul duo, We Are Tribe Soul. We are also joined by Ms. Tamara Winfrey Harris, a Gary, Indiana native, a writer, a sought-after thought leader, a philanthropic executive at Central Indiana Community Foundation, and a community organizer who has written 2 books and a score of articles. And her most recent book is Dear Black Girl, Letters from Your Sisters on Stepping into Your Power. And finally, our convener and prestigious fellow for the Center for Africana Studies and Culture, Miss ALelia Bundles, who is a former network television executive and an award-winning journalist and author. She is the author of On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker. She's the founder of the Madam Walker Family Archives and a brand historian for Madam by Madam C.J. Walker, a line of hair care products developed in partnership with Sundown Brands and Walmart. So we have a powerhouse panel, to say the least, and I am so excited to start this conversation, but I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Bundles for just one moment to talk to us a little bit about why these people, why this set of panelists, and why this topic for this evening. So Ms. Bundles.
Thank you, Joseph, and good evening, everyone. When Professor Etienne first approached me about developing a partnership with IUPUI's Center for Africana Studies and Culture, I was very intrigued. What a great opportunity to interact with students, with scholars, and with the community where I grew up. What a perfect way to learn from others and to download some of the knowledge and maybe a little bit of wisdom that I've gained during the last 5 decades as a journalist and as a biographer. The idea was irresistible as I thought about the chance to explore my many, many interests that range from African American history, women's history, American history, Indiana history, to politics, education, and voting rights, from social justice, philanthropy, and entrepreneurship, to enlightened neighborhood redevelopment, historic preservation, and how history is taught in our schools. So clearly enough topics for a decade's worth of panels. My very first impulse was to find a way to bring talented Indianapolis friends together with talented friends with expertise in the same fields who are from Indiana but currently living somewhere else. Instinctively, I knew there would be serendipity and the potential for collaboration. With Eric Deggans, Tamara Winfrey Harris, and Mariah Ivy as our inaugural panelists, the vision already is exceeding my expectations, especially with Dr. Joseph Tucker Edmonds leading the conversation. Today's topic grew out of a brainstorming conversation with Professor Tucker Edmonds and Africana Studies faculty. Many of you know that my book, On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, was the nonfiction inspiration for Self-Made, the fictional Netflix series starring Octavia Spencer. And some of you know that while I thought Octavia Spencer was great, I thought the scriptwriter and the showrunners truly missed an opportunity to tell a more authentic and accurate story. I was hoping for Hidden Figures, but I felt like there was way too much Real Housewives of Atlanta. We'll say more about that later. But that experience made us start thinking about how African Americans in Indiana and the Midwest are portrayed in popular culture and political reporting. There really was nothing in the Netflix series that felt or looked like Indianapolis. But that also is true about many other movies and television shows that claim to be in the Midwest. When we aren't entirely erased, we're often stereotyped, flattened, and turned into generic characters. So what do others think about when they think of Black people in Indiana and Indianapolis? And what do we think of ourselves? How did we come to be known as Naptown and Indianapolis? What is our identity? Do people think of the movie Hoosiers rather than the championship Crispus Attucks Tigers, Oscar Robertson and Ray Crow? Do they think there are only a few Black folks nestled somewhere between the cornfields and the Indiana 500 racetrack? Do they have any idea that some of us have ancestors who arrived in Indiana in the 1820s, or that Indiana Avenue was a thriving community where people shopped and lived and worshiped and raised their families, and yes, where jazz greats like Freddie Hubbard and Wes Montgomery once performed? Why aren't there more novels and biographies published by Black Indiana authors? What would our identity be if the Black community along Indiana Avenue and what is now Martin Luther King Jr. Street had not been demolished to make way for highways and IUPUI's campus? We need to examine that history, but also to acknowledge the current challenges. And this evening, we'll take a look at some of the hopeful signs. Indianapolis has changed a lot since I left for college in 1970. There's a skyline that didn't used to be there. There's a foodie scene, and there are professional sports teams. And within the last 3 weeks, there have been major exhibitions at the Children's Museum, Newfields, and the Heron Art Gallery. There's a new generation that's committed to lifting up culture in the city, and we are here to celebrate and encourage them. So, Professor Tucker Edmonds, take it away.
Well, thank you again for that framing and that context, but we're going to have an amazing conversation tonight to bring everyone in. And I want to start with an article that ALelia and I talked about when we were thinking about the conversation for this evening. We said in 2018, Tamara Winfrey Harris, who is sitting here with us this evening, wrote an article for the New York Times that was entitled, "Stop Pretending Black Midwesterners Don't Exist," that explored the ways that the history and the culture of Black Midwesterners have been erased, have been exiled, criticized or misrepresented in both the popular culture, but also in our historical narrative. And so I want you to start us off, and then I want the other panelists to join in on this conversation to think with us, what was the cause of this erasure? And do you think this larger argument that Black Midwesterners don't exist, or that people think that they don't exist, does that still ring true in 2022?
So I don't want to shock anybody, but I think the reason is racism. You know, I think from very early days of this country, the Middle West became associated with, you know, gritty white people making their way west and claiming what was manifest destiny, claiming what was theirs. This is the heartland. This is, as some might say, the real America. And I think this country has a hard time associating the heart of the country and the real America with Blackness. And so Blackness gets erased from the story of the Midwest. The Midwest gets erased from the story of Blackness. You know, one of the reasons I wrote that article is that after the 2016 election, I just got so annoyed with the way people were talking about the Midwest politically, because it was always, however will those, you know, the workers from the factories that shut down, how are those poor white people going to make it? And we've got to appeal to them, as if Gary, Indiana doesn't exist, as if Flint doesn't exist, as if many, many Black people have not been affected by the same things. And how will the people in the Midwest understand this identity politics that the Democrats keep talking about? All this Black this, and as if we're not here. I'm here, I understand it. So, you know, it's the racism. All of that gets obscured behind the ways that we want to see the Midwest, which is pure, which is like the iconic, the real America, and we don't want that to be about Blackness.
I absolutely agree. It's so interesting when you talk about erasure, because Black artists, creatives, entrepreneurs, we've existed and created and built as long as Indiana has existed. And I don't think that we are in the same place as we were in 2020, but it hasn't been without a fight. You know, it hasn't been without collaboration. It hasn't been without Black Indianapolis making noise and saying, hey, you can't leave us out of the narrative. We helped to write it, right? And now we are here taking back and controlling our own narratives. So it hasn't been without a fight, but there has been changes. But you're absolutely correct.
So of course I want to hear from Eric.
Yes.
And then I have some other comments to make.
I'd say a few different things. Number one, there's different levels of sort of awareness and erasure that we're talking about. So when you're sort of talking about political talk and you talk about the way in which the Midwest is talked about in politics, one of the things I talk about is that we often come up with euphemisms for whiteness. The mainstream media in particular has a tough time talking about white racial culture. And that in fact is its greatest strength. That's the greatest strength of white supremacy in America, is that it often isn't white racial culture often isn't articulated. So when they say the Midwest, they're really talking about a specific type of white racial culture, but they don't want to say white. So this sort of bizarre sort of stereotype about what the Midwest is that excludes Black people, one reason that exists is because it was created as a code word for rural conservative white people. So that's one thing. The other thing that I think is happening is that we don't have a lot of great depictions of Black Midwesterners in pop culture. There are more than you might think, because I started a discussion online. I asked some of my followers on Twitter to tell me about some of the great Black Midwesterners that maybe they've seen in TV and film, and we can maybe talk about that a little bit later. But we haven't seen a lot of TV shows or films, built around Black Midwesterners. As ALelia noted, Self-Made wasn't filmed in Indiana. It doesn't look like Indiana. You have to almost go back to the Jacksons miniseries in 1992, a 5-hour miniseries that ABC did, where a good part of it took place in Gary. That was a depiction of Black Midwesterners. And I got to bring up one of my favorite films from the 90s, 1996, Original Gangsters, believe it or not, filmed in Gary, Indiana, and set in Gary, starring Fred Williamson, Pam Grier, Richard Roundtree, Jim Brown, and all these blaxploitation stars came back to defeat the scourge of deadly gangs in Gary, Indiana, and it is a hoot. It's hard to see it. You have to order it on DVD. You can't even stream it. But that's one of the few films that I can remember that's completely set in a Black Midwestern town like Gary. I think often Black Midwesterners are urbanized. So, we see a lot of depictions in Chicago, but we don't see us outside of those settings often.
Yeah.
Well, and so when people talk about the whiteness and what's normalized as being in the Midwest, and when I hear people on some TV channels talk about the real Americans, and of course, as you all are saying, they mean white Americans, but in doing my research about Madam Walker and then about my family, I began to learn that I had ancestors who migrated to Indiana in the 1820s and 1830s. So from almost the moment that Indiana was a state, I had relatives who were here and who were part of settling Indiana, who had Black settlements. But that story, that historical story, is never told. It's urban, it's after the 1940s, it's after the Great Migration, but we have a rich history. And of course, we didn't learn that in school. I feel like I got a really great public school education in Indianapolis, but in Indiana history, none of those people were mentioned. Yeah. So we did not learn that. And we're dealing with both the historical erasure and with what's going on even now.
I mean, I want y'all just to kind of talk a little bit more about who are some of these figures in the Midwest. I think that, when we talk about Madam and your family, Madam Walker, I mean, I feel like people know that. We had the Netflix series. It has kind of bubbled to the top in certain ways, right, in terms of popular discourse. Are there other, well-known African-American figures that are from the Midwest that we sometimes don't recognize as being from there, and that their erasure makes it more difficult, right? Or the erasure of their hometown makes it difficult for us to talk about these unique subcultures that exist in places, like Detroit, or in Gary, or in Louisville, right? Can you talk a little bit about who we should be thinking about, or who we want our audience to reflect on?
All right, so let's start with Babyface.
Okay.
I knew somebody had to go there.
Yeah.
A proud graduate of North Central High School.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, right. That people don't often associate with, Indiana or the Midwest. I mean, folks like us in Indiana know that, but I don't know if everyone listening or everyone that thinks about the Midwest think about him.
Yeah, and I know Eric has something to say on this.
I was going to say, that the interesting thing is that a lot of people who are famous, who are from the Midwest, are associated with Los Angeles because they moved there to make it big. So of course, L.A. Reid and Babyface are two of them. The Jacksons, they moved to Los Angeles in 1971. So the bulk of their success happened when they were living in Los Angeles. I'm not even sure that people necessarily connotate Prince with the Midwest, but I mean, he put Minneapolis on the map and set Purple Rain and filmed it in Minneapolis. But still, I don't know that people associate him with the Midwest. And let's just talk about Motown in general, which started, in the Midwest as well, but, eventually also moved to Los Angeles. So I think one of the problems is that, some of the more notable people that we would associate with being Black and being in the Midwest eventually moved to Los Angeles or moved to another city when they really became successful.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, but even still, I feel like they had to have been molded and shaped by the Midwest. I mean, Toni Morrison, I was going to say arguably, but not arguably. Toni Morrison, the greatest writer of Ohio,
right?
Malcolm X, So, people don't associate either of them with Midwesternness, but they had to have been formed by Midwesternness.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even someone like August Wilson and, Pittsburgh, I mean, this is kind of Midwestern adjacent kind of, and the movement, this is the greatest, playwright of the 20th century, right? Yeah. That is coming from, not the coast, but kind of other places. Mariah,
Mari Evans.
Yeah.
There are several. When we had the mural, the Keepers of Culture mural reveal last year at Butter's inaugural event, I think a lot of people were surprised about Vivica Fox being from here. But you made a great point in terms of people needing to or desiring to move in order to make it big. And as an artist, that is a notion that we've been challenging for years. What is it that we need to create, whether it is reworking the infrastructure, opportunities, accessibility, equity, funding, all of these things so that artists feel like they can make it big, whatever that looks like for them here in Indianapolis, without having to take that talent and those gifts and that intellectuality elsewhere. So we're still thinking of it. And like I said, we've come a long way, but that has been overarching.
What's happening with Butter, and I want you to talk about that in Gang Gang, that how the exhibit, how Butter has changed things, how the We the Culture exhibit is changing things, and the Heron, the exhibit at the Heron Art Gallery is also a combination of nationally known artists, Indiana artists who are also nationally known. But talk a bit about how Butter and Gang Gang came together.
Well, Gang Gang, I mean, they're doing beautiful work. They're doing
Molly,
beautiful work.
Jeffers,
yes,
and Alan
Molly
Bacon.
and Alan are doing great work. But they both were doing amazing work before Gang Gang came into being. Molly specifically has always kind of been in the scene, in the culture, connecting artists to opportunities. That's even how her and I met. And so she's always had this heart and this love for artistry, and seeing them be paid and seen and heard and involved. And that's what I've loved about her work. But Gang Gang has begun to make noise. I think what's brilliant is the name in and of itself, right? And being able to bridge these conversations and these organizations with the name that they have. And it has a lot of cultural relevance specifically to Black people in a variety of ways. So I think that is beautiful. But what they are doing is they are going and having these conversations and sitting at the table, but they are using that as leverage, right, to bring other artists and activists into the conversation as well, who might not have been previously. So I think that is one of the major things, even with the mural, right? So I had the privilege of being a part of that mural, but what stood out to me is that they are making an effort to say, hey, we are naming Black Indianapolis. We are using our relationships and opportunities to make sure it's seen, to make sure they are a part of the narrative. And now you have to see it every day. Yeah. And now you can't drive on that highway without taking note of just a small fraction of the people who create and sustain Black art here, so.
I think
one thing I would point out is that it's one thing that's difficult is for artists to create art that also reflects the sense of place where they are. One reason why August Wilson is so evocative is because he creates a picture of Pittsburgh that's very distinctive. And you can watch his work, you can watch his plays and get a sense of what Pittsburgh is like, because it's almost like in the marrow of the pages. And I don't think we've had that for Black Midwesterners yet. So it's hard to point to a work, especially in film and television, and say, if you watch this, you'll have a sense of what, Black folks in Indiana or Ohio or, Illinois are like. It's been interesting to watch, for example, A League of Their Own. That's a limited series on Amazon that sort of reinvents the movie, but it's about these women in the World War II era who played in a professional baseball team while the men were at war. But the TV series also depicts Black people. There's a Black woman who wanted to be on the team. She has a friend. She has parents. She has a sister that she's estranged from. There's a whole universe of characters, Black folks living in the Midwest, that have been created as part of this series. So we're starting to see some of this in some places. I think the key is to get Black artists involved, Black artists who live this reality, who can create something that's set in Indianapolis or Gary or Terre Haute or Fort Wayne and or Cincinnati, and give you a real sense of what it's like to be there and why that place is different than New Orleans or DC or Philly or New York.
Mm-hmm. No, that's so important. Yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I think artists in the Midwest and in Indiana have to overcome two biases. And one is, regional bias. The idea that art, you say Midwestern artistry, and people are like, what? Art comes from the coast, people believe. Yeah. So you have that, and then you have the idea, if you're going to look at Black artistry, then surely it must be urban and on the East Coast, or it must be Southern, or it must be. So we have to overcome both of those things in order to be seen, and we do all the time and always have. But what happens as a result is what we've been talking about. Our Midwesternness is stripped from us. Like Prince is just Prince. He's not Midwestern Minneapolis Prince,
No, it's so true. Mariah, I was going to come to you too, because I was saying, when we think of popular culture all the time, and Eric, you really provided some real flesh around that idea. We often think about mainstream television, even our new streaming services, but there are other venues now that folks can produce images. We think about someone like, the folks from Insecure, and creating, from a podcast or from a web series, right? Are there other venues where you see young creatives or newer creatives creating on Instagram, on YouTube, trying to kind of construct a vision or a version of the Black Midwest?
So to answer that in short, yes. Really quickly, I wanted to make a point to Eric in terms of artists creating art that is indicative of where they come from, right? I think in order for that to even be accepted is people have to get more comfortable with the truth, right? And I think, the masses, we love these beautiful stories. And yes, there are beautiful stories to share here. I think that's one of the things that needs to be pushed to the forefront, is the beauty, the inherent beauty that exists here. But at the same time, Tamara, we were talking just before about proximity to whiteness. And the more you are surrounded by whiteness, the more you begin to think critically about your Blackness, right? And so many of us, we create and talk about race and what it is like to be Black. What are these intersectional identities we have? What is it like to be Black and queer and an artist and a woman in Indianapolis, creating and speaking to the times, especially representing the generation I represent, right? So there are so many conversations that people have to get comfortable with the truth, and we need more people helping to amplify that truth, no matter whether it's ugly, whether it's uncomfortable, whether it's beautiful, right? We need that. So yes, and then yes, artists are using all kinds of platforms now. Technology is beautiful if you use it well, right? Depending on how you use it. But there is a generation of young people who are fired up, who are inspired, who are hitting the streets, who are using all of these different tools, videography, photography, music, art. And we all know that creatives have been central to every major revolution, right? Right now we are seeing modern day griots tell the story, continue the tradition. So I'm excited about where it's at and where it's going.
Yeah, I mean, I love this idea because, one of the things you talk about, we've got to be comfortable talking about the pain. And this is one of the things that we've all talked about here, in 2020. Gang Gang, the group that we talked about here that was founded in Indianapolis, decided to call together a group of artists to kind of create a Black Lives mural, right? Molly Jeffers was a part of this. A number of artists in the city of Indianapolis were a part of this, creating a Black Lives Matter mural on Indiana Avenue, this historic thoroughfare in Black Indianapolis, right? In honor of folks like Dre'Jon Reed, who was in Indiana, Philando Castillo in Minneapolis, right? Breonna Taylor in Louisville, right? George Floyd in Minneapolis. All these Ferguson. Black and, Ferguson, all these Black and brown bodies, that were killed, that were exterminated here in the Midwest, right? And so becoming comfortable with telling that story as well, right? That the Black Midwest is not about getting to safety necessarily, right? But that it has all of the complexity that we're talking about here. So I want to talk a little bit with us about how do we think things have kind of evolved since 2020. How did 2020 change the way that the Midwest talked about itself, the way that Indianapolis has talked about itself? Do we feel a new sense of vigor and real kind of precision since that moment? Or how would y'all talk about that particular shift in terms of all of the areas and the fields that you're connected to?
Well, I mean, I'm not where you are, so I don't know how people are talking about it in the state. But I'm in Florida with Canada, and what I'm sensing is a lot of backlash. And what I'm sensing is that people who were, annoyed and worse by the way that George Floyd's murder put systemic racism on blast for everybody, they are now stepping into the light and making their opinions known. They're making it harder to talk about systemic racism. They're pushing back on some of the gains that we made. I even looked at, one of the small things that sort of happened in the wake of George Floyd's death was that, these incredibly exploitative TV shows like Cops and Live PD were taken off the air, where they're both back. They're on different channels. They're on lesser watched channels, but they have come back. And I think part of what we're seeing is that people have gotten fatigued and they're pushing back against some of the gains that we even made in the few months after George Floyd was killed, and people were suddenly ready to talk about systemic prejudice and racism and the deadliness of it.
Well, certainly I just remember that summer doing speeches, talking to corporate groups or others, and people would say, oh, it's a reckoning. Do you think things are really changing? And I just said, well, I hope they are, but I think I've lived long enough to know that ultimately when there is this light, there is a backlash. I mean, it's just it's a cycle that is very much a part of being Black in America, that it's coming. And there are still really great pockets of progress, and there are wonderful things that are happening with these art shows, with some other things. But the fact that books are now being banned, the fact that the history that we thought we were finally telling, a full multidimensional version of the history of Black folks in Indiana, in the Midwest, and other places, that there are now literally laws preventing people from talking about history. And so that means that the progress that has been made on that front is being pushed to the dark.
I think in terms of narrative, I very much agree with Eric. There is a tremendous pushback. I think it has changed the way we talk about ourselves, the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And I think I experienced a lot more defiance in people of color and Black people specifically, and our willingness to speak out loud and to push back, against some of the historic injustices. But I don't know whether that change is necessarily being coded as a Midwestern. I don't know whether the Midwest is being included in our conversation about reckoning, even though you have so many flashpoints that are actually in the Midwest.
There's one of my favorite books, Richard Pierce, who's a professor at Notre Dame, wrote a book called Polite Protest about Indianapolis. And so there is this sort of tradition of finding ways to accommodate, finding ways to fit in and to, make things okay for everybody. But I do think you're right. It's I'm really tired of making things okay.
We're accommodating anymore.
And I've had an experience recently. In my 50th reunion from high school was supposed to be 2 years ago, but it's actually happening shortly this week. And I was on a planning call with some of my classmates, and I went to North Central High School, which I say was not just predominantly white, it was overwhelmingly white. I had a great education. I enjoyed being there for the most part. But in this conversation in the planning, it was during the summer of 2020, right as the Tulsa Centennial was happening. And some of my classmates, we were on Zoom, and they said, "Did you know about Tulsa?" And I'm like, well, yeah, I know about Tulsa. But, it's because I know history, because I want to know history. But none of them had ever heard of it, and they didn't have to hear about it because it was not part of what they thought they needed to learn. They were sort of startled and embarrassed that they didn't know. But these are the stories that need to be told, because if people don't know those stories, then they keep repeating the same things. And I think that's part of the point in suppressing the stories.
It should be required reading.
Required.
Required.
The question too becomes that once you know, then what do you do?
Right.
What flabbergasts me is that people, on the one hand, are like, "Oh, I didn't know this," and "Oh, we should know this." Then on the other hand, they're sitting back as these laws get passed that prioritize people's feelings and deprioritize telling the truth. And I don't understand how on the one hand you can say, I'm surprised I didn't know about this, but on the other hand, you can sort of be asleep at the switch while legislators are passing laws that will make it much more difficult for future generations to find out the same thing. In an odd way, racism is like it feels sometimes like an immune system. And once we figure out a way to make an impact on it and convince people that systemic racism is an issue and get America to move to try and eradicate it, it figures out a way to sort of rejigger what it's doing and come back and push back and sort of protect a lot of the white supremacy that exists in this country and keep us from making the kind of headway that we thought we'd be able to make. And that's why so much of our progress is 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And it's incredibly frustrating, particularly when you hear people express these 2 ideas, at the same time.
Right. It's much easier to erase the ugly parts, and that's part of what we're talking about. Yeah. That these stories have been erased, and so then people don't have to deal with it, and we internalize that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, Mariah, I saw you were about to say something.
Yeah, I'm seeing a few things happen. I'm seeing, like Tamara said, people are speaking out. What I love to call the audacity. People are finding the audacity to say, hey, you need to listen, but not only that, you need us. This operation doesn't operate without us, and so I'm seeing that happen. I am seeing more collaboration. I am seeing, predominantly white organizations fund a lot more things, right? But Eric, you spoke to this awareness, right? And it's not enough to just become aware. It's not enough to say, hey, I realize it, I'm seeing it now, but here's $1,000 toward this, right? But that's also the beautiful part, I think, where I sit as an artist, because you want to book us to be your entertainment, right? But it is through these stories that we share through this art, and our hope is to mobilize, right? Our hope is to mobilize people to action, and we don't want to just come here through a performative lens. We are not here just to perform. We are here to disrupt, right? And to bring these topics into conversation. So I'm seeing a lot of different things happen, but I'm hoping that energy stays there, because we always see it pick up in light of, a black body being taken, right? A black life being taken. We always see it rise up and then it dies down, right? And so it's staying connected to that energy, to those feelings, so that the work doesn't stop,
Yeah, I mean, it's so important. Go ahead, Eric.
A quick plug in here for a book that's done by a friend of mine, and it's called His Name is George Floyd. And if you haven't seen or heard of this, it's a really amazing book that digs deep into George Floyd's family history, personal history, to try to show how all of these macro issues involving racism and systemic racism and prejudice, everything from the redemption and the establishment of Jim Crow America to the ways in which black neighborhoods were, destroyed by urban renewal, and the ways in which the opioid crisis and COVID disproportionately affected people of color. They take all of those big ideas and they relate them directly to George Floyd's family history. and his own personal history. And I bring this up because, he moved to the Midwest to try and get away from a housing project in a dangerous neighborhood that was feeding his addictions in Houston. And he came up to Minneapolis and wound up landing in a place where, even though drug deaths overall are among the lowest in the nation, for Black people, they're twice as likely to die from drug overdoses in that area than white people are. And he unfortunately came to an area where the health disparities with people of color were pretty bad, and not recognized because people had this picture about what the Midwest was, and it did not necessarily include Black people struggling in that way. So if you want to get a really sort of visceral picture of what that's like, check out this book. It's really well done.
I feel like that I think that you cannot see America if you don't see us. If you don't see the Black Midwest, you cannot see America. If you want to see the American dream, if you think the American dream exists, but if you want to see that story, one of the things I shared in my article was, it's my grandfather who migrated from Alabama to work at Inland Steel with an 8th grade education and sent his kids through, college, and was able to own, his own home. It's Madam C.J. Walker who became a millionaire. And, these are people who come, are descendants of slavery. And if you want to see the ways the American dream is BS, then you can also look at that story of George Floyd. You can look at what happened to a lot of the Black people who migrated north for opportunity, and then saw what happened when that opportunity crumbled and the steel mills closed and the auto plants closed. That is the story of America, and if you don't see us, then you are missing that story.
Yeah. No, that's so powerful. And I think that when we think about the current political moment, we're recognizing that some of the most regressive laws are being played out in the Midwest, in the red states, and the South, and those are negatively and disproportionately impacting Black and women of color's bodies, right? The reproductive laws, the laws about voting rights, the restrictions around access and for immigrants. And so we have a real set of real problems and issues that we've got to address. So I wanted to kind of pivot just for a moment, because I wanted to think about, we talked about this creative economy. We talked about the need to fund and to maintain the sustainability of this resistance through arts and through culture and through politics. And I'm going to come to you, Tamara, and then we can kind of broaden this. Is like, I want to know, where is the money in supporting and continuing and maintaining this kind of work that we've been talking about this evening, right? Are there networks of Black artists and Black philanthropists that are supporting and encouraging the kind of the future development of this kind of work, this kind of resistance, this kind of engagement? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
So first of all, there are Black philanthropists. We like to act like they're not. Madam Walker, Black philanthropist. Yeah. And we know right here at IUP, Dr. Una Asali has done a lot of studying around this. We all know that Black people actually give more frequently as a body than other groups. That is just true. We have always given. We've given our time, we've given our talent, we've given our treasure. That's how our communities have worked, even as they have been, under-recognized and underappreciated by other people. But even foundations, like ours, historically have not looked at Black people as funders. It's one of the things the Indianapolis Foundation and CICF are trying to change. So we all know there's a new African American Legacy Fund of Indianapolis that is trying to do that, build an endowment for Indianapolis to support it. But I think historically, because funders have not looked at Black people and harnessed them and cultivated them as philanthropists, then you also don't have funders with proximity to the problems and who understand the communities and can point to those places, the opportunities and the challenges in the neighborhood, because Black philanthropists have been overlooked.
Yeah. I want to come to ALelia here for a moment, because we talked at the beginning of the hour a little bit about the production and the depiction on Netflix of your story and the story of your family. Do you see that there are burgeoning opportunities to tell a different version of that story? Are there producers and groups that want to invest money in more accurate or at least different depictions of the Black experience in the Midwest or around? Talk to me about that. And Eric, you can jump in too.
Yeah, and Eric knows this story well. But one of the lessons learned for me is who tells the story, and it's not. And the writers and the showrunners were Black women, so it's not just that they were doing kind of the trope and what was a Hollywood version and sort of a cliche. But there are producers who really do want to get more at the nub of what's going on. Erica Dunbar was an executive producer on The Gilded Age. Yes. So she is able to infuse history. And I think one of my passions and one of my missions now is to really make sure that there are historians who are in the writer's room, because our stories don't fit the cliches. You can just do a story about two women who are in conflict with each other, but you also could do a story about the world that Black people were creating, that first generation out of slavery and the institutions that they were building. So those stories are happening, and it's important that we tell them. But we have to put ourselves in the room. We have to push for that.
Yeah, I think what we're discovering in this world of sort of high quality streaming shows is that the more culturally specific a show is, paradoxically, the more universal it can feel. So when you tell a story that is very accurate and authentic culturally to a small group, the viewer that doesn't know that group learns a lot. But there's a humanity that comes through the authenticity that they also identify with. And so the key is to, I think, convince producers and artists who are making these products that Black Midwesterners are a worthy subject for this kind of depiction. Because I think that's the hurdle that we have to overcome, is that, focus on Michael Jackson's story before he goes to Los Angeles. Tell us about how Babyface and L.A. Reid came together as the deal when they were in Indianapolis before they went to Los Angeles. Tell us about Berry Gordy founding Motown in Michigan before he moved everything to Los Angeles. How do we get people to find narrative excitement and creative, juice in the stories of us being in the Midwest and the specific cultures that we've created in cities like Cincinnati and Indianapolis and Gary.
Right. I mean, we need our version of August Wilson in Indianapolis, because there are stories that are just as interesting about the people who migrated from Kentucky to Indianapolis, the people who worked in the factories, the people who built homes, who educated their children. So those stories are there. They just have to be told.
I mean, I also love, when we're thinking, I want to move on to this next topic, but I love the power also of the individual donor, right? I mean, we talked about Black philanthropy, and oftentimes, I think, Tamara, you unpacked this for us very nicely, that it's not just the big money folks, right? But it is the everyday donor. And I think that was one of the things that we saw really, post Trayvon Martin at the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, that there were individual everyday donors, right, who were going to give $1, right? When we hear the story about institution building here in Indianapolis, we see, Black women giving dollars to build the YWCA, to build institutions, to support each other in training schools. And, again, I think that's the power, is that on some level, we are thankful for larger interest supporting it, but there are also the possibility that we have to self-fund and self-curate the version of us and the vision of us that we want to see.
Well, that's part of really what what Butter is doing. In making sure that the artists who display their work during that weekend, all the money is going to them. That's creating a new business model.
I think it's so important.
And it is possible to commission work. So it would be possible for even an institution like IUPUI to commission playwrights to write work that's centered in Indianapolis and make sure that it captures the flavor of Black folks in the city.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the powers of like the Obama presidency when they have these black artists that folks did not know about, unveiling these portraits in the White House. I mean, it becomes another model or another mechanism to elevate their work, but also to say there are other people that we can bring into the conversation.
Right. Well, and there is the play about Indiana Avenue that IUPUI has really elevated.
Yes.
So thank you for reminding us of that. And I do have to mention our good friend Tyrone McKinley Freeman anytime we talk about philanthropy and the important work that he has done.
Exactly. I want to let folks know that have joined us online that you can drop a question or an idea or a comment into the Q&A on Zoom, and we will be bringing those into the conversation shortly because we want you all to join us and to provide us your thoughts, your questions, your concerns. But before we get to that, I wanted to kind of like close out this first segment because I really want to ask this question. I mean, we've been talking, all evening long about this kind of this distinction, right? That about Black Midwesterners, and I want to ask, I want one of you to make an argument. Is this a real distinction with a difference, right? Is there someone on this panel that can argue that Black Midwestern identity is a difference worth addressing, right? So many people talk about, like Black lives and Black experience are pretty much the same under the rubric and the gaze of white supremacy, right? Whether I'm in Baltimore or New Orleans or in Indianapolis, right? So I want to ask, like, is this a difference that we need to continue to attend to? And what is the nuance that we are going to do as we attend to this into the future? What are the future conversations about, kind of attending to Black Midwestern identity? Who wants to jump in on that?
Well, I mean, I don't think you would ever ask if there was a difference between Black folks in Atlanta and New Orleans and DC and Philly.
Yeah.
I mean, we know all the different shades and differences in Black culture in all of those cities, and so we have that in the Midwest as well. Black folks in Gary have a little bit of a different experience than Black folks in Indianapolis because we're so close to Chicago and we're so influenced by what goes on in that city. And Black folks in those two cities are very different than the Black folks who are in Cincinnati or Louisville. And they're different than the Black folks that are in St. Louis. We have distinctive Black Midwestern cultures that I think people just aren't familiar with because they haven't been promulgated in pop culture the way some of these other, bigger, higher profile cities have had done. That's why we need to have this work out there speaking to how we are distinct and different.
I mentioned before we started that I had an argument on my social media page. All these people, Black Midwesterners, we all insisted that being Black from the Midwest was different, but we really couldn't put our fingers on it. So it's probably unfair to say, yes, there's a difference. Don't ask me any questions. I know it when I see it. and it's true. Like, I can spot another Black person from the Rust Belt, from the upper Midwest. There's just an attraction. I was like, that is me. I can't tell you what the difference is. It's there. Trust me, America.
I don't know. I'm kind of processing out loud because I think it is very much so still being discovered. I do think there's a difference. You just got to trust Tamara. But there is something unique. I think there is an identity, a collective identity we are slowly but surely peeling back, right? Because when you named all of those other places, Eric, I think when you think of those places, you can think of the fashion, the music, the art, you can think of all of those things. And I think what's unique about being in this place is that, one, we think about that proximity to whiteness, being surrounded by whiteness, but then what does it mean to find that voice? What does that mean to share our stories? And I think a lot more people, Black residents of Indianapolis, are starting to question, what does my being from the Midwest, have to do with who I am? How does it play a role in my identity or my art or my production or what I choose to do or the places I spent time in? How does my being from the Midwest play a role in that?
You just made me think. So I mean, maybe it's that our culture is often exported out of the Midwest and called something else. Because I was just thinking, except for Graceland, when you think of the place where people take musical creative pilgrimages to, Motown, Detroit, 2300 Jackson Street, Gary, Paisley Park, Minneapolis. Like, those are centers of musical creativity, but all of those people, again, had their Midwesternness taken away from them. So maybe that's why we don't recognize it, because it's been exported and called something else.
I think there's also a pride that, indie or Midwest residents have to start to kind of take, when you do go to the Los Angeles or those other places to quote unquote make it big, are you ashamed of saying where you're from? And I think right now I'm starting to see more people take pride in being from here, but we need that narrative to be pushed to the forefront as well, to give it a voice, to give it a name, to give it a, identity, so that people know we're here, been here. It's not just cornfields.
You make a good point, because how many black people do you, I always hear black people repping Brooklyn, or I'm from the dirty South, or how many black people you hear make it big and say, I'm a Midwesterner?
Yeah.
I say it.
I went on an East Coast tour, and
like hip hop in particular did a great job of sort of regionalizing things. And if you're from New York, there's a way that you talk, there's a way that you carry yourself that is embodied in the art. And if you're from LA, it's different. And it's codified in a way that everyone can understand. But we haven't had that in the Midwest. We don't yet know what that means. And that's why it's right for artists to come in and make those definitions for us.
And I think that's part of the reason why so many of us are having the conversation about infrastructure and what will help us to retain artists and entrepreneurs here, right? What can we give them to stay so that we are continuing to give that identity to Black Midwest? So,
But I think this is what I admire so much about what I see going on now, because literally 52 years ago when I left, I did not feel that there was a place to embrace me. I couldn't even, I was working in television, I couldn't get an interview at the television station. So I worked at WTLC for a summer, what was the Black FM radio station, and then I left because I saw that there were opportunities in other places that I did not see here. What I love about what's going on now is that you all have decided we're creating something. Our institutions are going to live for the next decades. And so it's like the stake in the ground has happened now, and people are saying we're going to create, because we know that our culture, our politics, all of the things that we are doing make the city richer. And there are some people who are recognizing that, and that is helpful as a way to empower folks. But it's still a struggle.
Yeah.
I have to add in that I think with that, right? So many of us, I think, have entertained the idea of moving or leaving or taking things elsewhere because we know that living here, we have to create it, and there is an aspect of, I just want it to be there, right? I just want the culture to be there and I can walk right into it. And if we want to see it here, we have to create it. And so I can't think about curation or creating or collaborating without also mentioning that there is an aspect of self-care that requires community work, right? And we also need to create these intentional spaces to breathe and release and say, hey, tag me in and let me help you do this work. Let me collaborate and help you lift this burden, because without that, we do become burned out. And I'm seeing so many people burned out on the work because they don't have that team, and we are yet building the infrastructure as well. So,
you talked a little bit about having your Midwesternness taken from you. One of the things that strikes me is that Gary, back in the late 60s and early 70s, was a prime example of a place that could have been a hotbed for this kind of creativity that we were talking about. When Richard Hatcher got elected the first Black mayor of the city, and then he brought Berry Gordy and Dinah Ross to the city, really all these Black notables to come and sort of celebrate what had happened in Gary and get a look at the city and encourage the Black residents there. And then within 10 years, the steel mills had largely shuttered. The economic base of the town was destroyed. White people had fled the city in unprecedented numbers and took their businesses with them. And what happened was that possibility for that creative spark was extinguished because the economic base of the city disintegrated, in part because white people fled when the city was taken over by a black mayor and his administration. And so one of the things we have to be careful about is that that can happen anywhere that we try to create this kind of hotbed in the Midwest, because we are surrounded by whiteness. And so I think that's another reason why maybe we haven't seen it in the Midwest the way we've seen it in Philly and Atlanta and New Orleans, and places where people of color have much more agency and control and aren't as surrounded by whiteness.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting because one of the things that we haven't talked about as much tonight is about black politics in the Midwest, where we have some of the earliest, black leaders. Where obviously we get our first black president from, from the Midwest. We haven't talked about this long tradition of the Black Panthers and other political and social action groups playing out in that particular way. I wanted to, before we go to some of the questions from our audience, and we're running low on time, but this is just a fascinating discussion. I want you all of my panelists to kind of share with us for a moment, what are some of the current artists or thinkers or organizations or installations or books, right? Eric, you already shared one with us that you think that our audience needs to kind of dig into, needs to go visit, right? We've talked a little bit about We the Culture that's down at Newfields and that's been produced and curated by Gang Gang and some other folks in the city. We've talked a little bit about some of those, but I want you all to share with us, like, who should we be listening to? What podcast, what music, what books, what installations should our audience be thinking about as they dig a little bit deeper into the Black Midwest that we've kind of made a case for tonight, and now we're gonna give them a syllabus or a playlist to work on for the rest of the week. Start us off. Who wants to start us off?
So I think of writers,
okay,
right?
Yes.
So and not all of them write about the Black Midwest, but they are from the Black Midwest. Yes. One, I would say the book Black in the Midwest, which is an anthology, but also I think of Samantha Irby and Desiree Cooper, and I always mess up his last name, Hanif Abdurraqib. Are some writers that I think of who are Midwestern based and kind of grown and made in the Midwest.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we have to mention Tamara's book, that as you did in the, right? The sisters are all right. Dear Black Girl. So that's important. But just a couple of other people who come to mind. Janet Cheatham Bell, who is from Indianapolis, who wrote The Time and Place That Gave Me Life, about really growing up in the 40s, 50s, and 60s on the south side of Indianapolis. And people will know her son's name, Kamal Bell.
Yes, yes.
But she is the person who created one of the Black quotation books, which is about to come out in a new edition. But Janet is very much steeped in the Midwest and writes about, I don't know that there's any other book where somebody is really writing about that period of time. Ashley Ford, Somebody's Daughter, which takes place in Fort Wayne. I listened to it on audio, and I listened to it in one day as I ran my errands. But that gives you, it's a particular family story, but it gives you a sense of it. Daryl Pinckney's High Cotton, which takes place mostly in Indianapolis. He has a new book that's coming up, but those are some nonfiction books that I think will help people, understand a particular example of people in the Midwest, in Indiana.
Mm-hmm. So, how much time we got? Because the art world, man. Okay, so the first thing I will say is that I would love for people to not only support the arts, but support by just showing up, specifically for Black artists, Black-led events. events curated by Black artists and curators. And that's such a significant point for me, because when I started curating that piece open mic and founded that in 2015, we started creating that. It was specifically to amplify the voices and stories of Black and brown artists. And there were so many people who were saying, you know, it needs to be more universal and it needs to be more inclusive, right? And I think those spaces exist. There are places you can go and hear a variety of stories, right? But there is something special about being able to go to an event in Indianapolis where we are centered and it is exclusively for us, right? So I have to note that, because yeah, come to the shows, come to the events. Yes. So in terms of artists, man, there are several. Gabrielle Patterson, as I said before, she's a part of Onyx Fest. Go to that show. She is a poet. She is a playwright. We need to support more Black playwrights. January York, she released a book. Chantel Massey, who's also a poet, and released a book, Bursting at the Seams. There are several young artists who are coming out of that open mic space, right? And so when you talk about grassroots work, right, we still host the cyphers and the hip hop shows and the open mics, and you know, come to those things, because I think out of that space you're able to hear what's actually going on currently, present day, what's happening, and the struggles and the beauty and all of these stories that come out of that. So the list goes on, but we out here. We are out here.
We're gonna have to send out a list to all the people that are joining us. So we're gonna send it out. Y'all just wait, just hold on. We're gonna send y'all something. Eric, did you have anything that you wanted to add to?
I mean, I wish I knew more film and TV projects that I could refer people to beyond the ones that I've mentioned. The only thing that keeps coming to mind for me is another great product that was developed in the Midwest by Black folks and then went to LA, which is Soul Train. And you know, you when you think about something that was sort of at the cornerstone of sort of the Black music experience for decades, it was developed in Chicago, but then moved to LA and became much more associated with that city. So I still feel like so much of what we've done, it was birthed in the Midwest, but it just wound up going somewhere else, and people don't associate us with it.
Yeah.
So I just, Eric, because we talked about this, I just watched 3 episodes of The Upshaws. You know, I binged The Upshaws. So, and Mike Epps, of course, is from Indianapolis originally. Well, then I will say, in those 3 episodes, I didn't really have a sense that I was in Indianapolis. It really looked very much like the Wayans show, except they did mention the Pacers.
You know, that's the problem with a lot of TV shows, especially situation comedies. You know, the Upshaws, the Ms. Pat Show, Parks and Rec. Yeah. I mean, even Stranger Things is set in Indiana, but you know, Indiana is really just a shorthand for sort of suburban, sort of rural America. That's, you know, Stranger Things could take place in Ohio or Illinois, and it wouldn't look any different because they don't really cultivate a sense of place that's specific to a certain city or even specific to the Midwest, and that necessarily. Stranger Things is shot in Georgia, and I think the Upshaws and the Miss Pat Show are filmed in Atlanta on sound stages in Atlanta. So that's part of the problem, is that some of these shows, you know, even Martin was set in Detroit, you know, but you know, these shows are filmed on sound stages in Los Angeles or Atlanta. They don't really have a sense of place.
Right. One shout out for a show that I think has an amazing sense of place, not Indiana, but is Midwest, is Southside. Yes. So as someone who lived for a long time on Southside and from Gary, Indiana, like that is the Southside, created by 2 brothers from the Southside, an amazing sense of place.
It is. It's an excellent show.
One thing that TV does do is it's good at depicting Chicago.
Yes, this is the question right now.
Yeah. You have ER, and you know they're good at distilling that. But you know, so set it in Gary or set it in Terre Haute or set it in Fort Wayne and forget about it.
Yeah. No, I was jumping right onto that, Eric, and I know we're running out of time, but we have a lot of questions coming in, but one of the questions is that Chicago both has an outsized role, but also seems to not identify sometimes, right, with the Midwest. And so the question was asking, like, what do we do with Chicago in this conversation? You know, are we making the argument that it is a part of the Midwest and it should be understood a part of this larger kind of Black Midwestern conversation that we're having, or is it somehow, absolved or not a part of this discourse?
I would argue the reason people try to disconnect Chicago from the Midwest is because it doesn't fit into that narrative of guns, flags, apple pie, and it doesn't fit the white narrative. Yeah. And so it becomes, we'll just carve that little part out and then we'll pretend everything else is the Midwest.
I think Chicago absolutely is, when the TV shows are authentic and they really do capture the city. Shameless, the Showtime series, that was set in Chicago. It wasn't set in any corner of Chicago that I recognized. Particularly authentic to me. So, to me, a show like that, we don't need to include it, but Southside really captures those neighborhoods. I mean, it's an amazing show if you haven't seen it.
And same thing with The Chi, with Lena Waithe, the Lena Waithe, produced and created show. I mean, again, looking at that specificity, one of the things, and I know I wanted to just ask you all, some of the things that folks wanted to know in the audience is, kind of who are your inspirations? They really wanted to know, like, who from the Midwest, and we'll kind of make it local for a minute, really inspires you in the work that you do. We have a TV journalist and TV producer here with ALelia. We have an executive and a writer with Tamara. We have a poet and an organizer with Mariah. So, who are the folks that kind of shaped and kind of led that path for you, or traced or carved that path out for you as you did and got into your work?
Listen, I will say my neighborhood, and this is the Midwest. I grew up in a neighborhood, a suburban Black neighborhood in Indianapolis that people jokingly called the Golden Ghetto. We were somewhat offended at the time, but it was a solid community where all the parents were there, and there were teachers and coaches at Crispus Attucks High School. There were plumbers, there were doctors, there were folks who made, you could leave your bicycle out. Now that was a particular moment in time, but it was seeing my parents' friends who were aspiring and who wanted us to succeed that really shaped me. And it was all kinds of folks, but it was also having my family, my father's family migrated. His parents had very little education. They migrated from Kentucky, from rural Kentucky, to Indiana in the early 1900s. They lived on the south side of Indianapolis, which was not the fashionable side of town. We would go visit. My grandparents still had an outhouse when I was a kid. They were hard-working people, always with a hustle. And so that was what inspired me. And it was seeing people like Dr. Frank Lloyd, who was a physician here, who owned the Black radio station, who had real estate investments, and my own parents.
Yeah, for me it would be my father, Chuck Deggins, was a columnist for the Gary Post-Tribune newspaper, and also was a jazz DJ, and also was a concert promoter, and also worked for Richard Hatcher. So, I got to see what it was like for somebody to, earn a living as a newspaper columnist, which I thought was really cool. I got to learn the power structure of the city by having Mayor Hatcher and his family be a part of my family. And because my dad was a concert promoter, I got to meet the Temptations when I was 6 years old. And I got a picture of myself, a black and white picture of myself, hanging out with the Temptations backstage at Westside High School. And that fueled my love of music, which eventually led me to become a musician at IU, and I founded a band. I got signed to Motown, and I did all this stuff. It was all because of the various things that my dad inspired me to do.
It's ALelia, a lot like you. It was Gary, Indiana. It was my neighborhood. It was the gift of growing up surrounded by blackness, where everybody was black. You know, the people who were achieving great things, like everyone. There was never an idea that you couldn't be whatever you wanted to be. I am Lake Michigan. I am Gary Roosevelt. I am boned and buttered perch. It is people like Eric's dad. I actually found, because your dad used to have the On the Town column, yes? I found an article that he wrote about my parents. It is all those people it is Gary, Indiana. Gary made me, and I am a Midwesterner. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. Similarly, starting at home, with parents. My mom, the youngest of 12, 7 aunts, 4 uncles, most all of them sing, drum, dance. They all do things. So I grew up seeing them go to the studio and record music, and so that kind of upbringing. But then also, I think Miss Deborah Asante had a lot to do with that as well, and being able to be a part of Asante Children's Theater and have that guidance at a very early age. But then I came into poets like Takesha Hines, who introduced me to a spot called Right on the Poetry Spot, 33rd and Clifton. And because that was one of the first little small venues that I performed in, I decided to start my open mic there. So we are in the neighborhood where residents are just coming in, like trying to see what we're doing. And it was poets like January York and Gabrielle Patterson who kind of offered tips and to some degree took me under their wing as well in different ways. But it was also moving to Chicago and meeting a professor by the name of Denanga who taught a Black Arts Movement course. And that course, in combination of living in that city, the kind of questions I began to ask, I began to develop into this writer, this artist, this fired up poet, but also began to question my identity as a Black woman, right? And so taking from all of these different things and traveling, coming back to Indianapolis saying, I got work here to do, so.
Yeah, you all are amazing. I know everyone needs to, follow you on Instagram or Twitter. Look them up, folks. I wanted to just end with a quote of ALelia's, and anyone can kind of respond to this last one. We have about 1 minute left, and then I'm going to hand it to ALelia, and then I'm going to sign off. But ALelia, you say our stories are our power. And she said, you said, I write the books and maybe the screenplays and the poems and the art shows that I wish had been written for me. And so I want us to think about, what voices and stories are we going to hear from the Black Midwest in the next 15, 20, 25 years, right? What are the books and the stories and the plays that we need right now? And so, any of you, we don't have time for everybody to respond to this, but what's on the horizon? What are the stories and the books or the plays and the songs that we need, that the people that are listening out there need?
I don't know. But I think that's the beauty of it, because artistry just springs from the moment. So, and it springs from need. So I don't know what the future is going to hold, but I am so excited about seeing it.
Yeah. And I'm hoping that these conversations that we're having, that there will be all kinds of students in Africana Studies who are going to write papers, who are going to present at conferences, and that that this is going to spark something that will help people say that your stories are important, because we sometimes need to be told that our stories are important.
Well,
Very much.
Go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to say, one thing that I'm doing is I'm working with a producer who's putting together a documentary on West Montgomery that is going to talk a lot about his roots in Indianapolis. And part of what we got to do is just keep reminding people that this art started in the Midwest, and that even though people may be familiar with it from LA or New York or wherever, was birthed here. And there's something about, the Midwest where it was birthed here. It was not birthed in these other places. And we just have to keep creating work that reminds people of that.
Well, I want to thank the audience for joining us tonight. I want to thank our amazing set of panelists, Ms. Mariah Ivy, thank you so much, Ms. Tamara Winfrey Harris, Ms. ALelia Bundles, and Mr. Eric Dagans for coming together and talking to us about the power of the Midwest, the unique nature of this story, and a real imaginative vision for the future and the possibilities of what is to come out of these amazing places in our landscape. I want to just remind folks that are listening that in February of 2023, we're going to have the next set of conversations with ALelia Bundles, and we're going to have an amazing time with scholars and thinkers and public intellectuals to talk about another issue that brings ALelia in conversation with the history of Indianapolis and the future of this region. I want to also ask folks to come visit our website for the Center for Africana Studies and Culture. Please check out all of our programs. Please check out the things that our students are doing, but also if you have some time and a little bit of money, make a donation to the amazing work that we're doing here at IUPUI and throughout the city of Indianapolis. And finally, as we close, I want to thank our campus and our leadership here, and particularly Dr. Karen Dace, who has been a supporter and a real hard worker in bringing Ms. Bundles to campus and supporting this series of conversations. We have had a fantastic conversation, and I know that this is only just the beginning. Have a great night, and we will talk to you soon.